my name is Sam Farmer, and perhaps for at least some, if not most of you, this will sound a little bit counterintuitive, but I am actually proudly and unapologetically autistic. Proudly and unapologetically. How did I get here from having been diagnosed as learning disabled, just shy of age 3, not finding out that I am autistic until age 40, and dealing with all the challenges that I did? How did I get from there to where I am today? That's pretty much the story told in my book of how I got from where I started to where I am today. In addition to the book, I would encourage you to visit my website, samfarmerauthor.com. Before, during, and after writing the book, and to this day I continue to write articles, carrying out my mission of advocacy. And in that sense, the book only tells part of my story. My journey would continue and continues to this day as I learn more about where I stand as a late identified autistic individual. And so there's plenty of free content that you can enjoy at samfarmerauthor.com. So like I said, a little shy of age 3, I was diagnosed as learning disabled and didn't find out I was autistic until age 40. Reason for that, when I was very young, autism wasn't being diagnosed back then, the way it has been in more recent years. And those of us, primarily in Gen X, the baby boomer generations, because of that, many of us found out much later in life that we were autistic. And some of us identify with what we think of as the, quote, lost generation, not to be confused with the lost generation that F. Scott Fitzgerald and his contemporaries wrote about, but our own kind of lost generation, in the sense that not until well into our lives did we really have a complete picture of who we are. Even though I lived the first 40 years of my life not knowing I was autistic, I still had a lot of things going for me. I had all the right people in my life, caring, compassionate, kind, smart people around whom I could pretty much be my true self without facing adverse consequence. I knew all the right people at all the right times. Because I was fortunate enough to be born into a relatively well-off family, with our socioeconomic status being what it was, and I think for all the wrong reasons, the fact that I'm a man, that the color of my skin is white, that I happen to be heterosexual, that I think that plays into maybe why I have fared better than others in my community have, again, for all the wrong reasons, where I write in my book that I long for a more level playing field for all of us. In those regards, and for other reasons that I write about in the book, I consider myself to have been only partially lost, but lost nonetheless, because of all kinds of questions that I had around difficulties I was having with socialization, with processing nonverbal communication, with awareness of self, awareness of other people around me, that it still by all means was no cakewalk those first 40 years. Autism is an example of something that can be looked at in more than one way. And the way that I've chosen to look at my own autism is to look at it not as the prevailing narrative around autism would have me look at it, which is that it's a disorder, that it's something that needs to be fixed or cured, but instead that it's what's called as a neurotype, that it's just that my brain and my nervous system are wired in some fundamentally different ways than most people. And that's what I mean by neurotype. The human population encompasses a multitude of neurotypes that exist under an umbrella that those of us in the advocate community consider to be neurodiversity. That within the human population there are a variety of neurotypes, the way our brains are wired, the way our nervous systems are wired, that shapes how we interact with other people, with the world around us. That autism is more of a way of being that should not be pathologized and stigmatized in the way that it has been, but that it is a naturally occurring neurotype, which, because it exists in the minority, and because all kinds of minorities, in all different kinds of respects, tend to be very unfairly stigmatized in society. That is the case because societal expectations around socialization, around behavior, around communication, around learning and thinking, that we are at odds with those expectations. That those expectations can be very, very disabling on us. And I have overwhelmingly found that to be true. And to some extent, I write about that in the book, in terms of dealing with bullying, dealing with unrealistic expectations placed upon me that I found to be very disabling. And as an advocate, what my hope is with the book is to try to convey a greater understanding of autism from the point of view of somebody who actually lives in these shoes, as opposed to somebody non-autistic writing about autism, inevitably externally. This is told from somebody who lives it and breathes it. And that with greater understanding of autism, ideally would come greater acceptance and ideally a greater sense of belonging in society for us. And so the book shares a bunch of stories of my lived experiences. And it also includes a good amount of self-help content in the sense that I've been very, very fortunate to have been able to find happiness and success in my life. And I share ideas and insights in the book as to how I was able to attain greater happiness and success. And I figured that in trying to help others who ideally would read the book and maybe gain some insights into how the reader could carve out a better life for him or herself, that this was the least that I could do in the book, is to try to help other people who perhaps haven't been as fortunate as I have been. And those self-help areas that I cover in the book are only those that I feel qualified to speak to based on my own lived experiences as a late identified autistic individual. And those include my journey in terms of learning more social skills, learning how to rise above bullying, workplace success, parenting, both from the point of view of me as a son to my parents, as well as me being a father to my own son. And perhaps most importantly, my long step-by-step journey to learning how to love myself. There's a lot in the book about self-esteem building, of how I was able to start out being a learning disabled, unidentified autistic individual who knew he was different, who had a really, really hard time coming to terms with that, and eventually was able to figure out how to finally become comfortable in his own skin. I feel as though I really didn't get there until around my mid-40s. It took a couple of years after the diagnosis at age 40 for me to get there. And those are the key self-help areas. But if the reader doesn't necessarily need to be reading self-help content in those areas, the book still holds value in the sense that, again, the stories of my lived experiences are very helpful in teaching what it can be like to be autistic and not know it for the first 40 years of your life from somebody who actually walks in these shoes. So, one of the things that I dealt with when I was younger, which I speak about and that I write about in the book and in articles that I've written since the publication of the book, deals with something called internalized ableism. And what I mean by that is that ableism is to the disabled as racism is to people of color. It's basically discrimination in society against those of us who are disabled. And the problem with that is that that kind of discrimination that exists in society often is allowed to sink under our skin and compromise sense of self. And that's the internalized part of it, internalized ableism. It's when you let that kind of discrimination get under your skin and wage war on your sense of self. One such story that I write about in the book takes place when I was in high school in the 80s. And my mother came home one day with what she thought was really great news. Sam, guess what? I was able to arrange for you to be able to take the SATs untimed. And I'm like, wow, how did you pull that off? But within a matter of just a few seconds, I very, very abruptly told my mother, no, I don't want these accommodations. I don't want anything to do with it. It's really because, and I only came to understand this in retrospect, that in rejecting that critical accommodation, that thank goodness it didn't, but it could have impacted what college I would end up going to. Needless to say, a very high stakes test, the SATs. That was the last thing on my mind. All I could think of was, I want to be like everybody else. I want to be evaluated on the same terms as my peers. I don't want to be different, even though I know that I am. I had no real capacity to accept my then known to me learning disability. That because I rejected it and resented it and didn't want anything to do with it, I ended up turning down an arguably invaluable accommodation. Prime example of internalized ableism. The external influences around me, the people around me, knowing that I was different from most people who I knew. Having the best of intentions, but often seeing the way I behaved, the way I communicated, rubbed people the wrong way. The prices that I paid for that. All of that had gotten under my skin and compromised my sense of self enough that I ended up turning down this kind of accommodation, which could have been life-altering. That in retrospect, why the heck didn't I take that? What a wonderful accommodation that would have been for me. I struggled with English. That was my weakest subject. I recall, like it was yesterday, not even coming close to finishing the verbal section on the SATs, because with my learning disability, I would process information at a very slow rate, particularly those reading comprehension passages. Reading comp was a real struggle for me. I didn't even come close to finishing the verbal portion. And guess what? Any question that you leave unanswered is marked wrong. And so my verbal score ended up being marginal at best. And in yet another aspect of how fortunate I was, somehow that didn't matter, luckily, in terms of me being able to get into my first choice school. So I'm very fortunate and very grateful for that. But had the admissions officer put enough stock into test scores, heaven only knows, he or she could have made a decision that would have altered my life in a very fundamental way and not allowed me to go to my first choice school. That is really the ugly side of what I'm referring to here as internalized ableism. It does great damage, and like I said, it wouldn't be until my mid-40s, thereabouts, when I think back. Already that's 10 years ago because I'm 55. That's a long time to figure out how to accept and how to be good with who you are. And I regret that I think largely because of societal discrimination, stigma, its effects on sense of self, that learning disabilities and that autism and other diagnoses under the neurodiversity umbrella, the way they're stigmatized in society, that look what it can do to us. It can have life-altering consequences, particularly in high-stakes environments like the workplace. I wrote this book largely to try to deal with the issue of autism acceptance. We've come a long way in many respects, but we still have a very long way to go. We, meaning the advocate community, trying to fight the stigma, rewrite the script on autism from being a narrative that centers primarily around pathology and deficit to one of being a naturally occurring neurotype, which carries not only unique challenges, but also unique abilities, talents that we have that are often lost in the narrative because of an overemphasis on the pathology and on the challenges. But that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to rewrite the script. So my only hope, really, with this book is that it would be my effort at doing something about the problem of acceptance of autism in society, which just isn't there. Autistic adults who are qualified and willing and able to work, the highest estimates have our unemployment, underemployment rate at somewhere around 80 to 85%. Autistic women are many times more likely to deal with sexual harassment and assault than are their non-autistic peers. And in all the categories you can imagine. Suicide rates, suicidal ideation, the whole list. I could go on, but you get the idea. All of those really critical metrics were considerably more at risk than our non-autistic peers. 2 towns over from where I live in southeastern Massachusetts, there's a school in Canton, which maybe some of you have heard of or maybe not, called the Judge Rotenberg Center. It's the only school in the country, much less the state of Massachusetts, known to impose electric shock interventions on its students for behavioral modification purposes. That and all these studies that have been done about how we struggle with employment, in relationships, in life expectancy, where on average autistic individuals face an average life expectancy, from what I've read, of around 58 years old, all point to this problem, in my view, of not enough acceptance of autism in society. And that's what we're fighting for. We wonder sometimes if we're getting very far, but we feel as though we have to at least try through sharing our lived experiences and conveying a greater understanding of autism, not from non-autistic individuals' point of views, but from our own point of view, where we're able to tell our stories in a way that nobody else can. That this is what we're up against. This is what we're trying to address. And lastly, the other reason that I wrote the book was to honor the collective legacy of my parents. My mother passed away in 2016, and my father a year later. The degree to which they helped me and helped others in their relationships and their professions was arguably immeasurable. My mother as a therapist, as a social worker, and my father as a doctor. I write extensively in the book about all the things that they did to position me for future happiness and success. And so out of gratitude for all that they did for me, I wrote the book in their memory to honor their collective legacy of giving to their clients, to their friends, to me, to my brothers. This is why I ended up really writing A Long Walk Down a Winding Road. Those are the chief reasons why. So, one point also that I drive home in the book is this notion of the people with whom we associate arguably will either make us or break us. And I attribute a big chunk of my success and my happiness to the fact that for the most part, I had all the right people in my life. Chief among those people, my parents. Certainly my wife, my son. That's another self-help area that I write about, is my take on being a good spouse, in addition to being a good father, to being a good son to my parents, all the other self-help areas. I write extensively about my workplace experiences, good and bad, again, to make the point that who we associate with will either make us or break us. It's been very true in my life. I had been bullied on several occasions, and I write about those incidences in the chapter on bullying. And clearly those are examples of dealings with the wrong people. And I write about, how to rise above those types of challenges. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that because I had mostly good, compassionate, kind people in my life, that when I had those encounters with not so good people, I was able to push through that and be okay. So, in a nutshell, that's pretty much what A Long Walk Down a Winding Road deals with. part memoir, part self-help. A lot of storytelling, a lot of sharing of wisdom from somebody who has had his share of challenge and adversity, in spite of all that I had going for myself. And again, if the self-help content isn't directly relevant, hopefully the stories that I tell about what I've been through would resonate. So there are two sections of the book that I thought I'd share with you. This first passage comes at the end of the chapter on learning how to love myself. If you are less than content, would like to feel better about who you are, and feel that the time is now to make a change, my hope is that you will find at least some of what I have written in this chapter and in this book to be useful to you. Working to build self-esteem was no cakewalk for me, though the time and effort involved were more than worth it. There is no greater gift than to love who you are. If you are ready to embark on this journey, consider the following analogy to the American Civil Rights Movement. Though there is considerably more work to be done with respect to improving race relations in the United States, the Civil Rights Movement did achieve lasting results and positive change in the face of all kinds of odds, and it did so without any help from the internet or social media. After centuries of slavery and in the midst of Jim Crow era segregation and discrimination. Furthermore, it required the efforts, struggles, and sacrifices of an immeasurable number of people, a multitude of individual acts of courage, protests and marches, federal government involvement, a timeless letter written from a jail cell, and epic court battles to succeed. The key takeaway: meaningful change is hard, slow to come, often achieved in the face of adversity, and entails many small steps taken over a long period of time. These are the ingredients of change that allow it to take hold and last, whether in society, at large, or deep inside oneself. Are you up to the challenge? I hope you are. You deserve it. Now, the final section that I'll share is the one chapter that I write in the book where I don't look back, but instead I look ahead to the future. And as a father, I can't help but center my hopes and dreams for the future around my son. And there's a lot of emotional power in that when I was writing this final chapter, I would often write it with tears in my eyes, because there's a lot of emotional power in writing with your son, your own son, top of mind. On Thanksgiving Day in 2018, a friend recruited me to volunteer with her at a local soup kitchen. As great as it felt to be reaching out to the hungry and homeless, that feeling paled in comparison to how awestruck I was when I heard how difficult it is simply to secure an opportunity to volunteer at the kitchen. My friend asked one of the folks who manages the kitchen about when she should call in so that she would be one of the first to be considered for a volunteer position for Christmas Day that year. Even then, she could not be sure that she would be able to offer her services. Oftentimes, she called the instant the kitchen was scheduled to start fielding calls from would-be volunteers, only to be repeatedly greeted by a busy signal. After hearing this, I thought to myself, if only goodwill of this magnitude could assume a life of its own, take flight, and extend itself to where it is needed most. Goodwill toward our planet, goodwill between differently minded people, enabling them to say no to hostility, to agree to disagree, to reach out and compromise, or to at least learn to peacefully coexist. Goodwill that keeps a would-be bully from targeting someone, or that levels the playing field for those who currently play according to different sets of rules. Yes, I admit that I am engaging in utopian wishful thinking, but wouldn't it be nice? This is the kind of world in which my son proceeds with his life, though only in my dreams. And that's all he wrote.